what we wanted to talk about. So I want to first introduce who I am. I'm a local community organizer here in the state. I do organizing across the nation with people who are behind the walls, people who are imprisoned. Our group here is called Millions for Prisoners New Mexico. I also have a chapter called Save the Kids from Incarceration. So we work on juvenile justice issues as well. I am part of the 505 Coalition, which is a group of grassroots organizations who come together, like Red Nation and Black and Pink and IWW and lots of other groups. I'm really honored to be here with you all, because the other alignment that we have with you is that Millions for Prisoners is now a new chapter in IWOC. So all of the labor that happens behind the walls will all be unionized in New Mexico as we're gaining membership. And the people who have just come home will be able to join the IWOC union. And so I'm looking forward to any kind of solidarity and alignment that we can help bridge, because our solidarity is what makes us powerful. And so that's part of the reason why we've had lots of conversation and relationship building recently, and just really trying to help build alliances and alignment in our values. And so tonight, I really the purpose of this talk that I prepared for tonight is I wanted to talk about the U.S. working class in a capitalist economy. And it might feel a little deep as somebody who likes to challenge systems and systems of oppression, power political systems, so that we can build power with the people. That's part of what this discussion is about. It's about how do we bring power to our people, right? And so a lot of this analysis is based on what's called Marxist political economy. So Marxism is a theory and method of working class self-emancipation. As a theory, it relies on a method of socioeconomic analysis that views class relations and social conflict using a materialist interpretation of historical development, and takes a dialectical view of social transformation. And you're like, what is that? Right? And what it is it's us acknowledging the power system that we exist in, and figuring out historically, how did we get here? What did our ancestors do in these systems? How did the resistance happen over time? For example, unions are part of that history, right? It's part of people building power together in solidarity against systems of oppression, which we're the working class. And so there's a major contradiction when we talk about working class people in a capitalist society. And so we, the working class, in this system of capitalism, the big assumption is that we're paid for our work. That's what we believe, right? As the working class, we're paid for our work. I make $10 for every hour that I work. But in a capitalist society, we argue that workers don't really get paid for the work that they do. They get paid for their capacity and ability to do that work. So we're paid enough to keep us alive to show up to work. So in the past, workers were paid enough to make rent, transportation, basic necessities. Now workers need more. We need phones, we need television, we need the other things that help our children to grow in this economy. And so we've gotten to that kind of a economic structure as the working class. But I still argue that the workers only paid enough for us to meet our basic ability to show up to work. In other words, our capacity and ability to work. So we're paid enough to stay alive. Marx calls this, called the access value, he calls it exploitation. So that's not a values judgment. So I just want to call that out. That's not a values judgment. It's just about analysis. How we think about that difference, right, of what our work, or the value of our work. So one can come up with a rate of exploitation by using the equation of what it costs to sustain a worker versus what the product, the difference between that is the exploitation that represents capitalism. So for whatever your product you're manufacturing, bread, right? For whatever that difference is hourly of how much you produce, that difference of what they sell it for on the market to what they pay you, that's the exploitation, that's the capitalism. That's what supports a capitalist society, that difference. So this formula is what the capitalist system is all about. The capitalists don't really do anything. So that's important for us to remember. Capitalists don't have to do anything because they hold the capital, right? They have the capital in the first place, and that's why they're allowed and able to exploit our labor, because they hold the capital, they hold the resources. So like primitive capital came from violent exploitation. So a worker has nothing to sell but their own labor, right? We don't hold the capital. We don't own the factory. We don't own the land. We don't own the trucks that manufacture and transport. So what we have to sell is our labor. It's our bodies, right? It's the labor of our bodies. And so those distinctions are important in this conversation. And so when we think about primitive capital, and I'm talking about like from the founding of this country, globally as well, having that big picture, you know, like it came from violent exploitation. Like people like the Rockefellers, they didn't just catch money that was falling out of the sky. That wasn't real. They got their capital because of a violent history of colonization and slavery. Original capital came from historical modes of violence against indigenous people all over the world. That's what primitive capital is. That's how they gained all of the resources to own all the land, to own all the factories, to own all the trucks. So in this capitalist society, the poor working class, white populations became convinced that their interest called for an attack on racialized communities. But in actuality, the suffering of the white working class has been caused by the same economic phenomenon of capitalism that led to the prison industrial complex, migration in the global south, and many of the other things that we see happening in our societies. And so that's an important distinction, because when we look at the political climate today, and we think about the structures that we exist in, the work that we do, and how the divisions happen in a society like ours, the working class has far more in common, I would argue, with immigrant community, with imprisoned communities, than they ever will with the capitalists who own the property of this land, right? And so that alignment is critically important for us to be thinking about as we're building unity with each other, because the whole idea, right, of people power that unions represent is that we, in our alignment, are strong enough to fight for the things that we need. Healthcare, education, a living wage, access to promotions, so that we can have stake in that business that we're supporting, that structure. And so that's what this alignment and this discussion is really about. It's about how do we build those bridges of solidarity with the working class, with the immigrant community, with all other marginalized peoples of this land. And I just wanted to talk a little bit because we do a lot of prison work, so I just wanted to call out a couple of statistics. So the United States claims 25% of all prisoners in the entire world, yet we're only 5% of the population of the world. That's massive. We have more prisoners than any other place in the entire world, by far. Also, I want to call out what's happening to women in our prisons. So there's more women in prison in the US today than that of all the genders together in the 70s. So female prisoners increased more than 700% in the last 20 years. The conditions that led to these increases in prisoners in the United States and other countries are the same conditions that have led to mass immigration and the impoverishment of all working class people. So us keeping in perspective that we are all in a common struggle. The same conditions that cause immigrants from the South to migrate for hope are the same conditions that imprison people here in this country. So I want to talk a little bit about the historical piece. So the 1980s is often called the last stage of capitalism. It has always had global aspirations. These aspirations are directly linked to global conditions that produce slavery. This political education argues that we should call capitalism racial capitalism. And the reason I call that out is because race is a social construct, meaning it's not real. Race was invented by the colonizers when they were conquering lands globally. And it was a way for them to justify having slaves. And the first slaves that ever were stolen from Africa and landed on this continent landed in Mexico. So the first African slaves were not in this part of our country, they were actually in Mexico. So there's this deep alignment about when we look at what that looks like and what formed the capitalist society that we exist in today, and how those resources were gained by the ruling class. So in this evolution, we see manufacturing going across borders. Capital freely flows across borders and moves easily. But when humans begin to move across borders, the consequence of that capital, they are deemed illegal. So as long as it's a resource that's benefiting the upper class, everybody's fine. So global capitalism from the 80s to present, nobody had a problem with the outsourcing of T-Mobile call centers overseas to India. And, you know, the societies, the industry never cared. They were bothered by that kind of back and forth economic structure. But it was when the people started to move back and forth, it became a problem. And that's because for capitalism to exist, for it to hold power, it has to have an underclass. And that's why we call it racial capitalism. Because it requires an underclass to exist. And I think that that's critically important when we're understanding what the power structure is. So also, this is also when the welfare state goes under attack in the 80s. International finance capital demands begin to move capital away from places that serve the community, like housing, away from the people, and towards productions of profit. And this begins to happen all over the world. This happens along with the wars that have driven people from their homelands to have to go and seek sheltered communities, seek a better place. So the same thing that we're experiencing that causes poverty here and causes prison industrial complex here is the same power structure that's causing the unrest in other countries around the world, around the globe. And that's the global capitalism. So this happens along with the wars that have, so the loss of jobs in the north of the working class and those who have always been vulnerable flows into the prison industrial complex. And so that's where we see that connection. So like as Ford is closing the plants in Detroit and as jobs are getting shipped overseas, now that working class back in this struggle. And so capitalism evolves like it knows how, and it figures out a way to still profit off of those bodies. And that's the increase in the prison industrial complex. So that's how these bodies ended up being fed into a system that still upholds capitalism. And so that's what that evolution is. So it feeds off of populations that can no longer find a place in the world. And with migration, people flow to places that appear to represent hope. And we see that now. So I also like to argue that the rhetoric surrounding the crisis at the border is not real. It's invented. Not that there's not caravans of asylum seekers happening because of the unrest in South America. I'm not disregarding that. But I am arguing that it's not what they make it seem. I organize in Doña Ana County, and I do work in Sunland Park. I do work in Anthony, New Mexico. I was just at these people got on private land, got millions of dollars to build this wall that they feel like represents, the wall's open, they can't close it. There's this big gate that's wide open. There's children swimming in the river right there in Mexico. People are not trying to fight to get across that. It's not real. So all of that rhetoric, I just want to call that out. That stuff, all of it is just that. It's rhetoric, right? And so, so white economic suffering is directly linked to people of color and poverty, and the tendency to lock up people who have been deemed unnecessary and irrelevant. And so that's what that profit structure looks like in the prison industrial complex. So when we talk about, like, we see the phenomenon of the recent elections in 2016, you know, white workers in the South have far more in common with immigrants and imprisoned people than they ever will the ruling class, because their struggle is our struggle. And so that's the unity building that has to happen. We have to have those conversations. And we also argue that if radical organizers had gave attention to white communities, to those who had seen the assault on the labor movement and the mass transfer of wealth to the already wealthy, we maybe could have prevented a Trump presidency, but it would not have solved the problem. Even if we had elected a white woman Democrat, the capitalist society would still exist. So we argue that because we have existed in a capitalist society for decades, it didn't matter who was elected, because the power structure is already in place. And that's what we should be paying attention to. And this is because 8 billionaires in America own more than 3.8 billion of the poorest half of the people combined. And that is obscene. Why then can people be so easily led that they are poor because immigrants cross the border from Mexico? And so that's something that we need to be thinking about. Like, what is that narrative telling us? And that's the power structure trying to divide us, because that's how they rule us. Because when we're all aligned in our struggle, we're powerful, and we will fight to make sure that our people get what they need. And so that's why I argue, that's why the rhetoric. And so you see the figure of the immigrant. So this figure of the immigrant is an ideologically constructed scapegoat designed to detour working class from recognizing how much they have in common with the immigrant, so that the worker is blinded to the fact that the same corporations that have caused their suffering has also caused the migration. And so that's why I wanted to come here to have this discussion tonight, because I want us all to be, from an organizer standpoint, how do we, the working class, How do we build alignment in the struggle so that we can make sure that our families have the things that they need, that we have a living wage, that we have some power in saying, no, you can't schedule people to work. We've already gotten this time off. How do we hold that power? And so those are the kinds of things that happen when we are all aligned in a common struggle. And so I wanted to have this discussion and kind of an introduction to the discussion about what it is to be the working class in a capitalist society, and kind of broaden that lens, because I think a lot of the time we listen to mainstream media, you know, and we're hearing the things that are happening, and they're showing us pictures of people, asylum seekers at the border, and all this detention that's happening, and then the other felons, and we have second-class citizenship of felons. There's so many things at play. And so we have to clear the mud out of the water and remember that we are all aligned in a very common struggle. And that struggle is not against each other. That struggle is because there's a ruling class, and that is capitalism. So that's what I have to offer tonight. Does anybody have any questions or discussion points? Pushback, because I'm all about that.
You mentioned the IWOC. Can you explain what IWOC is?
That's the Incarcerated Workers Union. So it's a union that was founded by people behind the walls. And so when we think about labor behind the walls, so first let me call out the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves didn't really free the slaves. There was an exception clause that was left in that says, except for if you've been convicted of a crime. So as long as you've been convicted of a crime, you can still legally be a slave in this country. And that's why people behind the walls make cents on the dollar. And so the IWOC is a union that was formed by workers who are imprisoned. So Idaho potatoes are farmed and packaged behind the walls in a prison in Idaho. And then they're sent out to the market to be sold, but the workers make 26 cents an hour for that labor. They are excluded from the labor protections that we have out here. And so that's why it was important for them to form the IWOC union, so that they could gain solidarity. Last year, we supported imprisoned workers in a work strike, and they had a list of demands. And the demands were that they get paid the prevailing wage for their labor. They're doing work for Boeing. They're building Boeing airplanes behind the walls in prisons. And so when we think about the kind of work that could be available out here, right, like those are all the intersections. Like Boeing is profiting off of slave labor because they are exploiting an unprotected class. And so all of those are all of the intersections in why unions are so critically important to labor in all of the schemes, all of the broad ways that labor reaches in the working class. And so that's what IWOC is. And they're under IWW. Any other questions or comments, feedback, debrief?
You know, we also marched in the prison strike last year. Not all of us, but I was there representing our union, and we marched with the IWW for the prison strike last year as well. And the same thing with the DSA. We had the DSA at our last meeting to speak to us, and they mentioned the abolition of ICE, which is something that I've been pushing since day one in office, and I'll never stop. And that's why we have been creating these bonds with our community organizers, because it's so important for us to remember that we're not alone. You know, that labor, like you said, labor is everywhere, and sometimes we forget that everything we do and everything that everybody else does, it's all connected. It's all labor.
Well, and working class families are the ones who inherently have all of the consequences of what those structures are. I'm sure that you have masses of members who have been impacted by police violence, by prisons, by poverty, by houselessness, by all of the abuses that happen in the society. And so, that's why it's very important that we continue to build alliances with each other and recognize that we are in a common struggle. Anything else?
I'm going to play devil's advocate there.
Please.
Okay, so these prisoners are building sheds. Okay, we only make bread, right? Well, we make, if we're lucky, $19 an hour. Building jets, I'm sure they get at least $29 an hour, right?
Maybe out here.
For out here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. But these guys also don't have a mortgage. These guys don't have utilities. They don't have groceries. They don't have Pampers. They don't have formula. So how do you equalize that?
And I want to push back on that just a little bit. So that comment helps me understand that you have not had a family member had to deal with incarceration directly. Because people who are imprisoned actually do pay for the lights in their cell, they pay for the food that they eat, they have to support their families on the outside, they have to pay extraordinary amounts just to even communicate with their families. They have their commissary, their food costs are at 300% inflated. So a pack of ramen noodles for a prisoner is inflated 300% to what you pay in Smith's grocery store. And not to mention the fact that they are sent far away to prisons in rural counties. So if I am a prisoner and my family's in Albuquerque and I get housed in Hobbs, New Mexico, my family has to travel 6 hours just to visit me, if they're lucky and able to have a working car, to have the ability and finances to do so. It is very, very, very expensive to be in prison. And that is part of the rhetoric and lies that they tell us, right? Oh, they have a bed and 3 meals a day and they don't, they could just lie around. That's not real. They have forced labor. They have to pay for every single thing they get. The food in prisons that Aramark brings to the prisons actually makes them sick. We have overwhelming amounts of people with renal disease and digestive disorders because the boxes that come to the kitchen are literally labeled not for human consumption of the food that they serve to prisoners. Therefore, they are forced into the commissary arena and pay 300% inflation on their groceries. They have to pay for the soap. They have to pay for a toothbrush,
toilet
toothpaste,
paper,
for anything that they have, clothing, everything. But they're doing it all with $8 a month from their slave labor,
Or from their family members.
or their family members. Exactly, precisely. And I do work with Angola. I do work with prisoners in Angola, Louisiana, who are behind the walls. Angola, Louisiana, is a prison that's 18,000 acres, and it's literally a plantation. It was a plantation. It's still a plantation. There are 28,000 people in prison in Angola on these 18,000 acres. They still pick cotton, and it's at 3 cents an hour. And when they did the work strike, they took the people who did the work strike and they put them into solitary confinement in the worst housing unit that exists, that is pure torture. And then they brought the solitary guys without telling them what was going on, because they can't hear, they don't know what's going on, they're isolated, and they put them back out into the field. And that's the tactic that they use regularly. And so, it's actually very, very expensive to be a prisoner in the United States. Whether you're an immigrant prisoner, whether you're a federal prisoner, whether you're a state prisoner, whether you're at the county jail, it's very expensive for prisoners and their families. It's a billion-dollar industry. And there's profits happening from every piece of the prison industrial complex. Whether it's the phones, commissary, visits, a TV, whatever, transportation, every single piece is exploited. And so, I always often argue, what would happen if workers today hadn't had a labor movement in their history, we would be those, that would be the exploitation that we would be living and existing in right now. But we had the benefit of resistance. They are still building that because the prison industrial complex as it exists today is still fairly new in modern society. That level of economic exploitation is about, maybe 20 years old. The way we see it today is $1 billion.
So how come we still allowing that?
Say it again?
Why are we still allowing that, knowing that we have people that keep helping us?
Well, there's not enough. There's not enough of us, right? That's why I'm here talking to you, because we need to build this alignment, and we need to be united in the struggle, because it's very easy for them to tell us these things, right? And us to be like, oh, those people, those felons, those immigrants, those people are bad, those black people, those native people, we hear that all the time. Always. It's been generational. Since the beginning. They have used those division tactics. Like I said, race is a social construct that was invented to uphold capitalism. That's where it comes from. And you can clearly see it on the census, right? There's lots of different people that are not represented for a box in the census. And that's because race is a social construct. Those are the divisions that they created. And I'm not suggesting that we can't acknowledge race as it exists today, because we know that we live in a racist capitalist society. That's what drives an underclass. That's what makes it possible to have 8 billionaires who own more than all of the people. That's what makes it possible.
So we are being misinformed about prisoners, because my husband has this friend of his that used to be a teacher, and he used to do it in Santa Fe, and he used to say those prisoners were treated like everything.
That's the rhetoric, right? Yeah, and anybody who believes that, I challenge them, go to a prison, talk to prisoners.
Stay a week.
Yes, get close. I think that's part of what helps us. Brian Stevenson has a discussion about the recipe for fairness and justice. And in that recipe, he talks about proximity. It's important that we're proximate to the most marginalized, struggling class, so that because if we can uplift that level of people, of humans in this world, everybody lifts. Everybody lifts. So we should be proximate to the most marginalized, suffering people. We should go there. We should be with them. We should be in the schools that are struggling. We should be in places where there's poverty. We should be present with houseless communities. We have to make those allyships with the outcasts, because that is how we will prevail in getting the resources and the things that our people need. That is how the working class can survive. We have far more in common with the marginalized than we ever will with the 8 billionaires. Any other comments? Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I just thank you all for having me tonight and being allowed to have this discussion. I appreciate it.
Thank you for
Look
coming.
forward to continuing to build relationships